If you rent a plane or are part of a club, you may have tossed around the idea of getting your own plane. And you've heard rumors that it could be cheaper to buy a plane than rent one. So should you do it? Should you rent or buy an airplane? How to figure it out? Coming up. Whether you're a student pilot, time builder, or just a recreational flyer, we've all thought about buying and owning a plane, but we're smart. We know that there are more costs to owning a plane than just the purchase price. That's why a lot of us rent, because we think that owning a plane is just too expensive. And it can be depending on what type of plane you want to buy and what its purpose is. So which is better, renting or buying? Well, it really depends. There are a lot of variables, pros and cons that we have to consider to answer that, and the answer is going to be different for each of us. Believe it or not, it doesn't always come down to cost, but if we look at cost, there should be this magical break-even point where it's technically cheaper to buy a plane than rent one. So let's dig into the numbers and see if we can find it. Alright, to figure this out, we need to look at three types of costs: owning costs, operating costs, and rental costs. Let's define these all really quickly. Ownership costs are fixed and have to be paid regardless of whether you fly the plane or not, and they include things like insurance, registration, hangar costs, maintenance, inspections, and loan payments if you finance the plane. Operating costs are variable and depend on how much you fly, oil and fuel being the two main components, but on some aircraft, ADs fall into this category too. Then there are optional things that we can add like engine and propeller reserves if we wanted to. And rental costs are, well, you know what those are, so we're just going to move on. So I'm using a fun spreadsheet calculator I made to pull all these costs together that'll help us find that magical number. I'm going to link it in the description so you can plug your own numbers in too. But before we jump into it, the calculator isn't perfect, but it gives a good high-level overview that should be very helpful. And the more accurate the numbers you plug in, the more realistic break-even point you'll get. Now, for example, we're going to use some numbers that may not be completely accurate, but they will prove our point. So let's pretend we're trying to decide between renting a 172 and buying a 172. And let's finance the plane to take full advantage of what the calculator has to offer. Let's start in the Input tab. You can see things are broken down into the first two groups we talked about, operating and owning. All you need to do is answer all the questions. Some of them you may have to do some research on or make some assumptions, but just make sure to fill them all in. I've gone ahead and entered in some operating costs with some basic information from my airfield, and the cost of an oil change from my mechanic. That and my engine's 1,200 hours away from a TBO and how much it would cost to replace it. For my ownership costs, I got a quote from an insurance company. It included a covered tie-down at the airport, some money for annual and few repairs, and a $50,000 airplane financed with 15% down at an interest rate of 4% for 20 years. After everything is entered in, the spreadsheet calculates for you and even spits out a rough estimate of your monthly payment. From here, we can move on to the dashboard. On this page, the calculator breaks down your operating costs based on 1 hour flight. Then it calculates your cost of ownership per year and breaks it down per month. Now all we have to do is add our rental cost per hour and boom! The calculator shows us how many hours we need to fly to break even. In our case, it's 77 hours. So you can see that the numbers start telling a story. In our example, you need to fly roughly 77 hours a year to make purchasing a 172 more economical than renting one. So let's go back to the main question. Should you rent or buy an airplane? Well, if you're planning on flying enough to break even, buy the airplane. But, and yes, there's a but, make sure you're not just taking into account your current needs, like if you're a student pilot or working towards a new rating or certificate. Sure, you're going to be flying a lot more right now, but what's it going to look like in a couple of years? If you're not going to keep flying those 77 hours, the answer is rent the plane. This way, you're not sinking money into ownership costs of a plane you fly maybe 50 hours a year. Now, there are some other ways to look at our equation, like what if you buy a less expensive plane than the one that you can rent? Well, that's when things start moving in our favor. Moving back to the spreadsheet, we can adjust our numbers to reflect our local rental costs and let's say a smaller, more economical, less expensive plane. By buying a less expensive plane, we can lower our break-even point by 20 hours. This begins to paint the picture of how it can be cheaper to buy a plane than rent one. This is especially good for avid flyers and student pilots. One thing that will really tip the scales is if you outright buy the plane instead of financing it. This eliminates a large portion of the ownership costs and really lowers your break-even point. Going back to our calculation, If we change this to a 0, we can shave an additional 20 hours off, leaving us with just 37 hours per year to fly to break even. So if you have extra money to invest in flying, this solution can work in your favor. Granted, you'll have money tied up in a plane until you sell it. As a side note, I've heard student pilots doing this to cut certificate and rating costs. They buy a plane, get their certificate or rating, and then sell the plane, allowing them to get the certificate or rating at a significantly less price. I don't recommend this though, for reasons that we'll discuss in a bit that affects all of our scenarios. Now there is one more thing we need to talk about when it comes to renting or buying, and it's something appealing that ownership has to offer: the lifestyle. So what do we mean by lifestyle? Well, it has everything to do with what you're willing to pay for convenience. Let's say you want to rent the plane, but when you go to schedule it, it's always booked by that jerk Steve. Because of him, you have to fly at a less convenient time or rent a different airplane. This is true in clubs and partnerships too, when scheduling can be problematic. Thus, the lifestyle of being able to fly where and when you want comes into play. This lifestyle comes at a price though. Going back to our break-even point discussion, if you're only flying 50 hours a year, your cost per hour can be much higher than renting. That's why I added this nifty cost per hour tool. You plug in the information on the plane you want to buy, enter how many hours you think you'll fly each year, and it spits out how much each hour of flight will cost you. Now, one thing we didn't really get into in our calculations is if you're part of a flying club. Flying clubs are a bit different and usually have monthly dues, fees, and rates that can change the equation. And because of this, it's really hard to calculate a break-even point, but we can still do it with some extra legwork. You'll need to add up all of your dues, fees, rates, and flight costs over the year and divide it by the number of hours you flew. This will give you a rough per hour cost for flying in the club. Then all you have to do is plug in the information for the airplane you want to buy, add the number of hours you flew with the club in the cost per hour tool, and compare the numbers. You may be surprised by them. So we've had a really good discussion so far, but there is one thing that can derail this whole buying an airplane train, no matter how the numbers add up: maintenance and repairs. You see, when you rent, the owner-operator is responsible for maintaining the aircraft, so when something breaks, they spend whatever amount of money it costs to fix it. But when you're the owner, you're stuck with the bill. And you can budget for this, but repair costs are one of those unknown things that could be a few $100s or a few thousand. This alone draws pilots to rentals and clubs so that they can transfer the risk to someone else. Now, this is technically a comparison video, and it wouldn't be complete with a few pros and cons, so let's list some. Granted, we've touched on a few of them already. Starting with buying, the pros are convenience, flying when and where you want, the plane is always how you left it, and the pride of ownership. Some of the cons are unknown maintenance costs, stuck with one type of plane, and higher insurance costs. To me, the biggest winner is being able to fly when and where I want. I love being able to fly up into the mountains during the weekend just to see the high country. But the biggest loser for me is maintenance, for the reasons previously discussed. I help maintain a plane and I know what it takes and what it costs to keep one flying. Now for renting, some of the pros are no maintenance costs, fixed hourly rates, lower insurance costs, and you can take a break from flying if you want. Some of the cons are scheduling, availability, like when the plane is suddenly in maintenance, outdated avionics, and oftentimes you're limited on aircraft types. Typical rentals are 172 and PA-28 platforms. Now for renting, the biggest winner to me is fixed hourly rates. Sure, no maintenance cost is great, but knowing how much I'm going to spend on flying is better to me for some reason. It allows me to budget my flying each month. Now, the biggest loser is scheduling. Going back to that jerk Steve, some people tend to dominate the schedule, and it's hard to fly the plane when you want it or are feeling spontaneous. So, rent or buy? Which is right? Like I said in the beginning, the answer is going to be different for each of us. Both options have appealing aspects, but I just wanted to throw as much information out there as I could to help you figure out what's right for you. Now, before I end this video, I just wanted you to know that I intentionally left out partnerships. If you're looking to buy a plane for one, that's a whole different discussion, and if you're already in one, you technically own a plane, so... Alright, that's just about everything you need to know to answer whether you should rent or buy. Hey guys, thanks for watching the video. Make sure you give it a thumbs up if you found it helpful, and leave us a comment down below if you think we missed something on how we're looking at this. And as always, share aviation wherever you can, and we'll see you in the next one.
Yeah. Alright, Tiffany and I are up here flying.
We should probably start again because I was still being ridiculous.